The whispering statue. Pedro had always loved a good drink. It was his way of unwinding after a long day, a simple pleasure he indulged in whenever the stress of work and life became too much. On this particular evening, however, he had taken it a step too far. The old bar down the street, with its dim lighting and sticky floors, had become his second home. Tonight, it was unusually quiet, with only a handful of patrons scattered across the room. Pedro sat at the counter, nursing his fourth or, was it fifth, glass of whiskey? "You should slow down," the bartender muttered, eyeing Pedro with mild concern. Pedro waved him off. "I am fine. Just one more, okay?" The bartender sighed but complied, sliding another glass across the counter. Pedro tipped his hat in thanks and turned his attention back to his drink, savoring the warmth as it coursed down his throat. By the time he stumbled out of the bar, the moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the deserted streets. Pedro's footsteps echoed against the cobblestones as he made his way home, his mind clouded by alcohol and a growing sense of unease. Something about the night felt off. The usual sounds of the city car's honking, distant chatter were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on him. As he turned onto a narrow alleyway, Pedro's gaze fell on a peculiar sight, a statue he had never noticed before. It stood at the center of the alley, illuminated by a single flickering street lamp. The statue depicted a robed figure, its face partially obscured by the hood of its cloak. Its hands were outstretched, as if beckoning him closer. Pedro chuckled to himself, shaking his head. "Must be the whiskey," he muttered. But he couldn't resist the pull of curiosity. He approached the statue, swaying slightly, and peered up at its face. "Strange," he murmured. The statue's features were unnervingly lifelike. Its eyes seemed to follow him, glinting in the dim light as if imbued with a consciousness of their own. Pedro took a step back, a shiver running down his spine. Then he heard it. Pedro. The voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a jolt of fear through him. He spun around, expecting to find someone standing behind him, but the alley was empty. Heart pounding, Pedro turned back to the statue. "Pedro." This time, the voice was louder, more insistent. Pedro staggered backward, his eyes wide with terror. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The statue remained motionless, but the air around it seemed to shift, growing heavy and oppressive. Pedro's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he stumbled away from the statue, nearly tripping over his own feet. "You are drunk," he muttered to himself. "It's just your imagination." But the voice came again, louder still. "Pedro, you cannot run from me." Pedro's blood turned to ice. He turned and bolted down the alley, his mind racing. He didn't stop running until he reached the safety of his apartment, slamming the door shut behind him. He leaned against the door, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. It was just the whiskey, he told himself. Nothing more. But deep down, he knew better. The next morning, Pedro awoke with a pounding headache and a vague sense of unease. The events of the previous night felt like a hazy dream, but the fear lingering in his chest was all too real. He shook his head, trying to shake off the memory of the statue and the haunting whispers. As he went about his day, Pedro couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The sensation was subtle at first, a prickling at the back of his neck that he dismissed as paranoia. But by the time the sun began to set, the feeling had grown unbearable. On his way home, Pedro took a different route, avoiding the alley where the statue had appeared. But no matter which path he chose, the feeling of being followed persisted. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of his vision, and every sound a rustling leaf, a distant footstep set his nerves on edge. When he finally reached his apartment, Pedro locked the door and closed all the blinds. He poured himself a drink, hoping to calm his frayed nerves, but the whiskey only seemed to heighten his paranoia. He sat in the dark, staring at the walls, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. Then, he heard it again. "Pedro." The whisper was faint but unmistakable. Pedro froze, his heart pounding. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. He grabbed a kitchen knife, his hands trembling, and crept through the apartment, checking every corner. "Pedro, why do you hide?" The voice was louder now, taunting him. Pedro's breath hitched as he turned toward the living room. There, standing in the center of the room, was the statue. Pedro screamed, stumbling backward. The statue was exactly as he remembered it, robed, hooded, with those unnervingly lifelike eyes that seemed to pierce his soul. But now, its hands were no longer outstretched. They were clenched into fists. "What do you want from me?" Pedro shouted, his voice cracking. The statue didn't respond. It stood motionless, an unyielding presence that seemed to sap the air from the room. Pedro's mind raced. Was he losing his grip on reality? Had the whiskey finally driven him mad? In a desperate bid to escape, Pedro lunged for the front door. But as he reached for the handle, the statue's head turned, its gaze locking onto him. Pedro froze, his hand hovering inches from the door. "Pedro," the statue said, its voice low and menacing, "you cannot escape your fate." With a burst of adrenaline, Pedro flung open the door and ran into the night. He didn't stop running until he reached the edge of the city, collapsing onto the pavement, gasping for air. The streets were deserted, the silence oppressive. Pedro glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the statue following him, but the alley was empty. For weeks, Pedro lived in fear, jumping at shadows and avoiding the alley where the statue had first appeared. He drank more than ever, trying to drown out the memories of that night. But no amount of alcohol could erase the image of the statue or the sound of its voice. One night, as he sat alone in his apartment, Pedro made a decision. He couldn't live like this anymore. He had to confront the statue, to face whatever fate it had in store for him. Armed with a flashlight and a heavy wrench, Pedro returned to the alley. The street lamp flickered as he approached, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The statue was there, just as he remembered it, standing silently under the dim light. "I am not afraid of you," Pedro said, though his trembling voice betrayed him. The statue remained motionless, its eyes fixed on him. Pedro stepped closer, his grip tightening on the wrench. "What do you want from me?" he demanded. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the statue spoke. "To remind you of your sins." Pedro's breath caught in his throat. Memories he had buried deep began to surface, the lies, the betrayals, the mistakes he had tried to forget. The weight of his guilt pressed down on him, and he fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I am sorry," he whispered. "I am so sorry." The statue seemed to regard him for a moment, its expression unreadable. Then, slowly, it raised a hand and pointed toward the horizon. Pedro followed its gaze, his heart pounding. In the distance, the first rays of dawn began to break through the darkness. When Pedro turned back, the statue was gone. From that day forward, Pedro's life changed. He quit drinking, reconciled with old friends, and began to make